Hello, everybody. I'm writing down visual revolution, so you'll hold it very firmly in your mind, because we're all part of it. It's something that I'm sure you know, but maybe you haven't thought of, and maybe you haven't really separated out from your knowledge of it, because we can't miss it. It's something which has happened to everybody who's living in the 20th century. We all go around in a new visual world. It is new from every point of view, from the things that we actually see, the fact that we see more than we used to see. There's more things, leaping for our attention. Just the invention of the billboard, for instance. Think how that has changed your life. I mean, it's made not only the cities different for us, but it's made the country different too. There's almost nothing in nature that has so deep a plot to gain your attention as a billboard has. And consequently, when you drive along the road or when you drive along the street, it leaps to your mind and to your eye. You have to see it. Now, that's just one thing that is clamoring for your eyes, reaching for your attention, waving to you, saying, look at me, look at me. That kind of training we all have. And I wanted to point out to you see, in the last few times, the way that the artist is a part of this 20th century revolution and is actually, in very many instances, has made that revolution, that visual revolution. It is in part really due to him, due to his exploration beyond the things which were immediate and familiar that everyone saw and everyone knew in the 19th century. As part of this thing is really due to the artist and is due to his exploration. He's daring to go beyond. Because, remember, the artist always has, and always will, I suppose, look at objects of art. And one of the funny things that happens if you ever have read much that artists have written, they always say, I go back to nature, I return to nature. They always are talking about their great close bond with nature, and how this is the thing which is so important for all artists, and how all artists have always looked at the natural world. Well, they have looked at the natural world, but they've looked at it perhaps in two ways. One way, they have looked at it through the eyes of another artist. Now, not necessarily just one particular artist, but in a way the accumulated vision of the artists that preceded them. All artists do that, every single one of them. And in a way they have looked at nature through themselves, their particular reactions, their own life of the imagination. So that when they look at nature, when they say they're terribly dependent on nature, you may be surprised to discover it isn't the nature that you mean at all. Now, before the 20th century visual revolution, artists were looking at nature, and they were looking at nature through the eyes of other artists. I have brought you some things this morning that I hope will, in a way, horrify you. I'm somewhat horrified by them, because they represent the way of looking that prevailed at the end of the 19th century. All of the things that I'm bringing you today were a part of an old collection of art. It was a notebook that someone kept in the 19th century. And the works that were reproduced were, a number of them, the prize paintings from the year 1882. Now, you see, that isn't really so terribly long ago. There are a lot of people living, my own parents, who can remember that year. And I'm sure that a number of you know people who were perfectly conscious, grown-up people, able to look around them and take notes on life and understand what things were about in that year. And yet, when I show you the works of art that were prize winners and were thought of as very good in that year, I think you will immediately feel that here's something almost unbelievably distant from you. I'll show you one that I looked at for quite a while. Now, this is a photograph, of course, this is a reproduction or photograph of the picture. But I looked at it for quite a while before I could be absolutely positive that it was not itself a photograph. That is, that this was actually a painting. And the only way, really, the way that I caught on that it was a painting is that it's signed. It's signed, E. Danton, 1882. And it is from the the exhibit of that year, of modern art of that year. Now, by this time, the things which you are familiar with, I'm sure, the paintings of the late 19th century by people like Gauguin and Van Gogh, were already really available to people, as they were known by artists. But this was the kind of thing which was acceptable in the exhibits, acceptable in the art exhibits. And when you look at this and you think, well, how on earth could anybody, how could they paint this way? How could they even, it just wears me out to think of starting to paint in this manner. Because what you have here is a perfectly marvelous facility, a technique that is, it's extraordinary. You have the effect, as somebody said who was looking at it just now with me, almost a stereopticon effect. The cues of vision are given you so that you feel the depth of these things quite decidedly. And the whole the persistent interest in detail, all these things show a phenomenal skill. But to what end? To what possible purpose? Now, that artist was trying to imitate the natural world, but he was not using only that world. He was looking at it through the eyes of a great many other artists. I could show you really dozens of pictures which would be exactly like that. If you think it's very photographic and that it is in a way an impersonal recording of the truth, it isn't. It is a style, though it's still an obscure one for us. And here's another instance of what was immensely popular before our great visual revolution. This is a piece of sculpture. And here again, I think you can hardly believe that anyone would quite go to this much trouble. I think there's something perhaps essentially comic in the idea of making an overstuffed chair in marble. Imagine going to that trouble, For what? Again, for what? And it's a highly successful overstuffed chair. You can see all of the fringes and all of the pleats, and you can see up here, and this little child is sleeping on a pillow that has lace, marble lace around it. And everything about it is brought to a very high degree of realism, and then what on earth are you going to do with it? Because imagine, this is life-size. This is not something that you can put on a mantle. This is a life-size thing. And where on earth are you going to put it? You obviously can't put it in the living room, even if you had an enormous living room, because it would be continually confusing to people by its extreme realism. What on earth can you do? Well, you can't, there's nothing you can do except put it in a museum, and that's exactly where it was, in a museum, in the modern museum, or what corresponds to the modern museum in Paris at that time. Now, another thing which the artists felt that they could do before our great revolution was to imitate a previous style. Now, imitate, I use that word with a good deal of caution, because the artist, in a way, always has to see through the form or the vision which is given him. And this isn't exactly imitation. Now, one of the things which was given him at this time that he could follow was the classical world. That is, the late Roman classical world. Another thing which he could follow was the Renaissance world. Now, this is very, very late imitation of that. And I hope that you will feel, as I do, that though this is a close approximation of the attitudes and facial types of the Renaissance, that this kind of trick of the Christ child raising the veil and peeking out at you is something that is a late invention, and maybe not a very good one. Well, the artist sees through, looks at the world through, in a way, other eyes, and always must. He looks at it through those eyes, in this instance, limited. Now with the 20th century, almost limitless possibilities that he can see through. Thank you. I'll see you next time.